Today I will talk about, let's say, one of my latest assignments, Perpetual Next, where I act as an advisor. And I will tell a little bit about what we do to do carbon removal. There it is, the usual disclaimer. Having said that, let's do the talk. I have three parts. I tell a little bit about carbon credits because there's some misunderstanding about carbon credits. I'll tell a little bit about biochar, but I would like to leave this with the, let's say, the renewable carbon concept, which I think is also very important. Okay, so this picture shows, well, you guys know all this, but this is just depicting the problem from early ages on. We had carbon formation below ground, and from the industrial civilization, we took it from below ground to the atmosphere. And now the challenge as 2022 is to bring the carbon back from the atmosphere, the CO2, to prevent climate change. And we do that by reducing fossil fuels, and we try to go back to pre-industrial times. Let's talk a little bit about numbers. Climate change in brief. Of course, this, you know, the increase of the CO2 in the atmosphere measured in Hawaii. What I just want to point out is the scale, 300 to 400 ppms. Mind you, that is only 0.04%. Skeptics say, what difference does it make? It's so little CO2 in the atmosphere. How can it lead to climate change? What I usually say is compare it to a fresh bowl of water with a droplet of ink. Then it colors. That's how little CO2 can make a big difference. Where does it sit? Well, we know this picture. How much time is left? As you can see from the globe, how much we emit before we have 1.5 degrees climate change, it's 311 gigatons. And I will show you another approach to this. There's 311 gigatons left to emit before the blanket around the Earth is that thick that we will exceed 1.5 degrees in temperature. Now, let's say we have 7.5 billion people on the planet, okay? That means if we would allocate a budget to every living person, there's only 41 tons left CO2 if we would divide it up. If you look at what an average EU person emits per year, it is 8 tons per year. That means individually, we have only 5 years left. I, as a European, have only 5 years, and then I have to stop. I should have a zero carbon footprint if it would be equally divided around the world. So Rob Jetten, our Minister of Climate, you have only 5 years to do something about this if you would divide the wealth in the world equally. Okay, now what have we decided to do? You know this picture. We said by 2050 only we have to be net zero. Net zero means two things. We need to decrease our emissions, but there will always be unavoidable emissions, as you see here. So we need to also remove carbon from the atmosphere to really be net zero. And just to avoid any misunderstanding, let's look at this picture. Traditional offsets are overly focused on decreasing emissions, but there will always be unavoidable emissions, as you can see here. So really, to be net zero, you need to remove carbon, then only we are net zero. I mean, it's sometimes people say, I compensate, so I'm net zero. But I say that's comparable to I kick my dog twice a day. Now I do it only once a day. So +1 - 1 is 0. I'm a dog lover. No, you still kick your dog once a day. Okay, so net zero is really a task. And you know, I'm rubbing my hands when I see all these companies saying we're going to be net zero, net zero, net zero. And I think, you know what? You will have unavoidable emissions. you need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. I don't think a lot of people realize that. Anyway, let's go to the carbon credits in more detail. We know climate change is a problem of nature. It was translated into an economic problem. And for that reason, the EU has made 6 different directives to curb the emissions. And that's what we see in life. The first one is the ETS, the European Trading Scheme. That is the reason, for example, that the Hamburg Centrale was closed and that the prices of cement are increasing. The second one is the Renewable Energy Directive, the second directive. That's why we have E10 fuel for cars. That's why we see wind turbines. That's second law. The third one is the Energy Efficiency Directive. For example, that's why you have a smart meter at home. You have no incandescent light bulbs anymore. Your refrigerator has an energy label, and your house needs an energy label. That is because of the third directive. The fourth directive is the land use change in forestry. That's why, for example, the water table increases. The fifth one is the emission performance for cars and vans. And that's why we have lighter cars and more efficient engines in cars. And we have electrical vehicles. The sixth one is the effort sharing regulation scheme. That is how we divide up between the countries the EU target. But I highlight this because these are all legislative measures geared towards carbon emission reduction and not to removal. There is no legislation for removal yet. So, like I said, it's a problem of nature. We made it a problem of the pocket. So, what governments try to do, they try to put a price on carbon. But what's the price on carbon? How you do it? Well, you can follow 2 ways. You can do it with compliance carbon pricing and voluntary carbon pricing. Let's first look at the top one. Compliance carbon pricing has different schemes. There is a carbon tax, which was introduced in the Netherlands just recently. There is an energy tax, something we all pay on our energy bill. There is the ETS trading scheme, which is in different countries or different regions of the world taking place. And we have result-based climate finance schemes like SDE+, feed-in tariff, PCTs. They all serve a purpose. They all have a different means. For example, a carbon tax is a fixed price on carbon, and ETS is a variable price on carbon. It depends on what government you have, what legislation, what is introduced. And then we have the voluntary carbon schemes. That is a voluntary way of removing or reducing carbon. And on the one hand, so that's the supply, and on the demand side, there's a voluntary buyer. For example, if you fly with KLM, you can voluntarily buy carbon credits. There are 2 kinds of there are reduction certificates and there are removal certificates. Now, all in all, if you do a count, apart from these subsidy schemes, there are in the world 63 different carbon prices. So there is not one carbon price. Keep that in mind. When we talk about the carbon price, usually people talk about the EU ETS. Let's say the price of the EUA, the European Union allowances. That is the most common referred to carbon price. Now, quickly, what is it? Because it's important to understand. The EUA is a cap and trade mechanism. If you are in certain industries like power generation, chemical industry, cement, then in Europe, you are mandatory part of the scheme. In Europe, there are about 30,000 installations which fall under the EU ETS scheme. And as a whole, that scheme, those 30,000 installations are allowed to emit carbon, the green blocks, and every year it's decreased. So you need a permit to emit. The permit are the EU allowances. So they are not carbon credits, they are allowances to emit carbon. Okay, I just wanted to have that pointed out to avoid any, let's say, confusion. Now let's look at the voluntary carbon markets. There are a lot of voluntary carbon schemes, what we call the VCS. These are voluntary schemes like cooking stoves, reforestation projects, whatever you can think of, and you can calculate how much CO2 you avoid or you capture, measure it, verify it, and then you have a carbon credit. Now let's take an example from my own situation. I buy my gas, my natural gas from Green Choice, and it's called forest compensated gas. But I thought, what is it? Let's ask what they do. So I got a response from Green Choice, and they said, well, we compensate the CO2 emissions from our customers by asking them a small fee, and then we buy credits from international parties to compensate your emissions. If you look at the website, you see they have a lot of projects listed there. And that's number 2. They also do 10% of their budget on forest projects in the Netherlands. They don't generate certificates. It's just a matter of, call it goodwill or commitment to CO2 compensation. Now, then I looked up, where do they buy the credits? And you can go to the Vera registry. That's a database where all the verified projects are visible. And then you can find, okay, that slide isn't in there, but then you can find Green Choice uses a project in Uganda where they do reforestation. Then I can really find Green Choice is the buyer of the credits which they sell or which they use to compensate my gas usage. So that's how the circle is closed, and that's what you can do to check whether this is a real scheme or a phony scheme. Okay, so far about credits. Now, what do we do at Perpetual next? We provide natural alternatives for fossil materials for manufacturing steel and plastics. So we take waste wood, agri residues, we torrefy it in a torrefaction scheme, I'll show you later, and then we make chips or pellets which are used further. So the grand scheme is as follows. We have CO2 which is absorbed by trees and wood waste and agri residues, which is then torrefied. We make 2 products, biocoal and biochar. Biochar is used as a soil amendment, and biocoal is used for industrial use. Now, how does it look in practice? Here you see a facility in Estonia, which is called Botania. This is coming on stream, and we use the forest residues in the plant. You see a picture of the plant, and the end product is here. Those are the pellets. Now, how does it look like? The heart of the whole technology is a torrefaction reactor. Here you see a scheme, and a torrefaction reactor is nothing more than, I would say, the oven which you have at home, the furnace, which is heated to a couple hundred degrees, but without oxygen. And then the residues go in it. There's no oxygen in there, so they won't burn, but they get heated. And this is the effect you get as a function of the temperature or the time. You can see it becomes darker and darker, and that is because the volatile components are emitted, and so the energy content increases. This is a self-sustaining process. The gases evaporating from the residues can be burned and they deliver the heat for the oven. So it's a closed circle. You don't need external energy to use it, to operate it. So what do we get? So, like I said here, depending on the time and the temperature, you get different energy content. It goes from 20 to almost 30. And we give it a different name, but we call it carbon pigment, we call it carbon reduction, coking carbon, or biochar. But the only difference, in fact, is how long has it been in the oven and what is the energy content of the material. Carbon fertilizer is a name which is in fact the biochar. And Mart and Berend will tell a little bit more about biochar in a moment. Coking carbon is, for example, a material which we use for the steel industry, which is used by the steel industry. What is biochar? Biochar is an organic soil amendment. This is just a picture to see how it's applied in the soil. Okay, you see it is used and mixed with soil, and it has certain advantages for the soil. And again, Mart and Berend will tell about it, but it also is a way of bringing back carbon into the soil. You close the circle. Now, I want to talk about a different component. As I showed before, the whole legislation for emission reduction is geared towards emission reduction. So what we do, in fact, is we have made a scheme where it's not forbidden to use fossil fuels. It's only forbidden to emit them in the atmosphere. Now, I think that is a flaw in the whole approach. And that's what I want to close off with this part. If you look at the products derived from carbon, they are all around us. In our homes, the appliances, the soaps, the perfumes, the textiles. If you wanted to live carbon-free, you would be naked. Because you cannot wear your clothes anymore, you cannot drive a car, nothing. If you look in your car interiors, your tires, all made of carbon. Your food and drinks, a lot of it is carbon and a lot of it also has the packaging. It's made from oil and gas, similar for construction materials. If you look into what the chemical sector uses, they consume about 14% of the global oil and 8% of the global natural gas supply. But that doesn't end up in the atmosphere, it ends up in materials. And if you look at what's happening, here's another way of looking at it. If you look at the global carbon demand for chemicals and derived materials, in 2020, it's about 450 million tons of carbon. That is all, 84% is fossil-based, 5% recycling, a little bit is CO2-based, and a little bit is bio-based. If you look what's happening, by 2050, we will almost more than double the use of materials derived from carbon, because we use less and less metal and we use more plastics and fibers like that. Now, if we don't find a replacement for the fossil-based feedstock, we're going to have a problem, because we're never going to be net zero. We need to find alternative sources. Now, this is a scenario, and this is a scenario made by the Nova Institute in Germany. But Shell has similar scenarios. How do we phase out fossil carbon at all by 2050? We need to recycle more, definitely. We need to also reuse CO2 by capturing technologies. But we also need to deploy much more bio-based feedstocks as a source material for the chemical industry. Now, that is the alternative use for torrefied materials. So not only biochar for soil amendment, but also as a feedstock for the chemical industry. And I noticed this is a field which is really not covered a lot. It's only slightly emerging. Whereas the Netherlands, for example, has a big chemical industry. What is the feedstock going to be by 2050? Okay, this was an intermezzo, which I want to put on the agenda. I want to close off with Perpetual next partnering. So we use our torrefied materials, for example, to manufacture green steel together with ArcelorMittal. We're developing a green gasification system together with Haas. We're looking into carbon neutral cement with Heidelberg Cement, and we're doing a biochar soil amendment application together with the University of Nottingham. So these are applications of biocoal and biochar to reduce the use of fossil carbon. So I like to close off. We always talk about decarbonization, but I hope that you understand that I'm an advocate of using the word defossilization. In fact, the mistake we made is we put a price on emissions, and I mean, this is of course a theoretical thing, but in effect, we should have put a price on extraction of fuel and gas from the soil. Now, that's of course a complete different scheme, but okay, this is where we have to live with. But I think this is an important issue for the next 10, 20 years to look into. Okay, so my vision, by 2050, we will have a battle for biocarbon. Who can have access to biocarbon to make responsible products? And this is not only about economics, but it is also about who can afford to make a responsible product. Which industry should be supplied with biocarbon, considering climate impact? I mean, we all know using biomass for power generation to burn it is the worst thing we can do. That should be stopped immediately. But we should deploy it much more wisely, let's say as a soil amendment or as a biocarbon, as a chemical feedstock. And that's where I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
We are Berend, Haas and Mart Bruijn, and unlike Albert, we are not for that long yet in the sustainable business. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a small introduction of who we are. We both come from Maastricht. That's actually where we both grew up, and we used to know each other there. Then I went to Utrecht and studied biology with a special focus of microbiology and plant biology. And yeah, Mart, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I studied economics in Utrecht, and in the end in Amsterdam, I studied environmental economics, focusing on carbon credits and the whole systems that, as well, Albert already explained. And yeah, Berend came to me about the biochar, and from the 1st of September, we took a leap of faith and purely focusing on what kind of role we can take in this market.
Yeah, so we are looking into what role we can take, and since the 1st of September, as Mart said, we have a small office which is next to the kindergarten of Swen's children. We had to decide what our role would be. Of course, in the first, we want to make our own biochar, and we want to do everything ourselves. But then we discovered that we have a more valuable position, not reinventing the wheel, and not trying to create better biochar or something. But there's a slight gap between the producers of the biochar and the end users of biochar. And we try to fill in this gap in the Netherlands. And therefore, we are looking into a couple of possible application markets, which are agriculture, feedstock, cattle feedstock, forestry and urban plantation. And we do this also in the very start of the work in collaboration with Perpetual Next. And we then focus on the certification of biochar. So you have to certify biochar with the European biochar certificate, and you have to have some other certificates for end users to want to use it. For example, GMP Plus if you want to use it in the cattle industry, and for example, SCAL if you want to have a biological stamp on your product or an organic stamp. And there we try to find the right market for biochar. But the thing is about biochar, every biochar is different, because as Albert already explained, it depends on the feedstock you have, it depends on the duration of torrefaction of the duration, and it depends on the temperature you make the biochar. There's also a couple of different technologies you can make biochar with. And there's a lot of research done on the use of biochar, for example, in the agriculture. But every biochar, it's not often mentioned which biochar with which characteristics is used in those experiments. So it's really important, if you want to put your biochar on the market, if you want to see where the biochar has the most value in which application, you have to do pilot tests with biochar. And that's also what we are trying to do for biochar producers and in the end for end users. And when you've created a good pilot and you have found the right market, and then we can also, of course, create carbon credits, which will be more increasingly valuable, as is explained by Albert in the previous presentation as well. I give the word to Mart, who will tell you something about carbon credits and carbon removal.
Yeah, so biochar is, as Berend already explained, valuable for two reasons. One is the application, where our role comes in, and we find the right applications at the right place and creates value. But on the other hand, it's a carbon removal. It's not a reduction, it's a carbon removal. And Albert already explained that this kind of credit is sold on the voluntary market place. And on this marketplace, the biochar carbon removal is sold at a premium price in comparison with, for example, a reforestation project. And if we take a deeper dive into this carbon removal market, there are several aspects which lead to the quality, but also the price of a certain carbon removal credit. And the most important one in the end is the permanence. While, for example, direct air capture and biochar has a permanence of at least 1,000 years, the most biochars at least 1,000 years of carbon storage, you can say, okay, then we already probably have solved the whole climate change crisis. But the reforestation can be, for example, only 50 years of permanence. This makes a kind of carbon removal credit already different per quality, but also in the price. One constraint is very important, is that it's additionality. And so the meaning that the carbon removal would not have taken already anyway by, for example, another subsidy, or a carbon leakage, which means that if you put in your carbon removal, it would lead to a carbon emission somewhere else. The third one is very important, it's verifiability. So, for example, a quite upcoming theme is carbon farming, where the monitoring is quite difficult to do. You want to know where the carbon removal comes from. Is it because of the trees on your land? Is it because of the crop change? You want to know that, and there's a lot of science about it, but you also want to monitor it. Yeah, we have a kind of a carbon balance. That's the only problem we have. There's too much in the atmosphere. So if we can quantify everything, it makes it way more easier to get it more into control. But not all, it's, for example, in the carbon farming industry, it's so integral. So you don't know and always see where the carbon removal comes from and what the amount of this carbon removal is. And for the full transparency of a carbon removal credit, it's very important to have it. And for example, for biochar, it's quite easy to analysis because you have an LCA already at the plant. And then the last one, I think it's maybe the most important one after a while, because when you enter the whole carbon removal market, just as we were also very two young enthusiastic guys, we were just focusing on the carbon removal. we didn't look at all at the side benefits of, for example, the biochar. We were focused on, okay, we have a big problem. There's a need, of course, for carbon storage, which makes you a bit blind. And we found on LinkedIn, we found an image about the carbon tunnel vision, which you can create if you are purely focusing and intrinsic motivated about the climate change. But there are more things than only the carbon. And most of the times, if you look at, for example, biochar, if you look at the side benefits, it can indirectly lead to extra carbon removal. And let me explain you why our biochar can create extra benefits. If we look at this image, you see ecotoxicity. Biochar can already absorb the toxins, and it's not available anymore for plants when you apply it to agricultural applications. For example, biodiversity loss. When you would apply biochar at the cattle industry, you mix it, for example, with manure, you have less nitrogen deposition. So the nature is being kept as it was, and biodiversity loss is decreased. If you look at eutrophication, biochar can absorb all the nutrients and it won't leach out to the groundwater. We have a better water in the Netherlands then. In the Netherlands, not a lot of people know it, but we have quite kind of a water crisis. The water is not always that good. We pay a lot to filter it. But if you can already solve this problem together with the carbon removal, it creates an extra value for the public good. Health is, of course, also a kind of a characteristic biochar can play a role in. If you have a biochar applicated to the soil, you have more microbes, there's less toxins, so your food you need less pesticides, for example, so your food is already more healthy, which already also leads to less costs in general. So what I want to show here is that carbon removal, of course, is a very big potential solution to climate change, but can be more than that. There are a lot of public good problems, and if we don't price it, then for example, biochar is not a valid business model, because if we get the same price for a reforestation project, the whole business model of biochar won't be done. So that's I think the most important part to understand, that when you see a carbon removal credit for biochar, for example, 200 euros, that you don't be shocked, but understand, okay, the permanence is longer, but there are also side benefits of the applications of biochar. And one last, I think, important question the EU has at this moment, there's a consultation about getting the carbon removal into the ETS system. They want to monetize everything. I can understand that. They want to have one system where also the carbon removal is being paid by a carbon credit, by switching the carbon credit for allowances. But if you would do that, the more expensive carbon removals don't have a chance anymore. People would only focus on the less expensive, for example, reforestation. But in the end, all scientists already agreed on the fact that if we want to solve climate change, it's complementary. It's no one solution. We don't have the feedstock for using biochar as the one solution for fighting climate change. Biochar is one of the solutions. Jordan, they gave 100 solutions, and that's also what we're trying to do with biochar. It's one of the solutions. So for the EU, it's very difficult to not kill a market such as biochar if they want to implement it into the system. And if you want to use extra regulations to subsidize a certain removal carbon, it's quite difficult, because how do you want to exactly monitor the qualities of a certain carbon removal? And the good thing about the voluntary market is that the price is justified by the people who see the problems of not only the carbon removal, but also about the permanence and about the side benefits. And I think that's an important characteristics why we can have a chance in the biochar market, but the biochar market itself can continue. And yeah, as Berend already told you, we're new in this market. We're finding our role as a kind of a central place where we connect the end users and the producers of biochar. We give consult to a lot of biochar producers at this moment, and if you know someone we can talk to, let us know. And if you use the QR code, you can contact us via LinkedIn.